been following them and what they've been doing, and believed in the efforts that they put forward. I was invited to a small meeting with a couple of the members, and they introduced me to Steve, who I call the missing link. Steve Suau addresses us today as a regional and local watershed manager and stormwater expert to discuss a proactive approach for addressing the nutrients that fuel harmful algae blooms such as red tide. He is a professional engineer with 35 years of experience in Southwest Florida. While most of his professional career has been in the private sector, he did serve as stormwater director for Sarasota County between 2002 and 2006. In 2009 and 10, he served as the engineering representative for SwiftMud on the state's Technical Advisory Committee for the statewide stormwater treatment rule. This has been addressed by some of the speakers. It is in this content that I've asked him to come speak to this commission. So, Steve Suau.
Thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to address the commission tonight. Is there a way to get this PowerPoint up?
There you go.
Okay, great. So first of all, I have to acknowledge the Hands Along the Water folks. They've grabbed my attention. I usually try to keep a low profile, but this toxic algae thing has just been so overwhelming in all the communities here that I feel compelled to speak to it. The stormwater rule that the state had drafted approximately a decade ago was followed by a decade of research before that, and a recognition that nutrients are increasing. The number of natural water bodies in the state of Florida that are being designated as impaired for nutrients has been going up and continues to increase. From a stormwater manager's perspective, it's been difficult to relate to the general public why nutrient pollution is important until recently. Nutrients are usually invisible, but now they manifest themselves in a red and green and blue color. So the public is acutely aware of what nutrient pollution is about. And it's made the job imperative to try to address that problem. So I don't know if this is the new normal, but I do know there are things that we can do and that we do know. So algae is naturally occurring life form, but it's usually not toxic. There's many forms of it. The harmful algae blooms are rare, but we have two of them that are occurring relatively simultaneously, the red tide and the blue-green algae. In general, we know that red tide thrives in salt or brackish water and is fueled by the nutrient nitrogen, while blue-green algae thrives in fresh water and is fueled by the nutrient phosphorus. While nutrients exist in nature, and even in the case of nitrogen in the atmosphere, man-made sources of these nutrients, typically associated with fertilizers and wastewater, can overwhelm our soils and waters. Stormwater runoff's role is to carry or wash these excess nutrients into our canals, rivers, estuaries, bays, and ultimately the Gulf of Mexico. While there's not a single solution or silver bullet, this presentation focuses on a preventive and proactive action, as people have discussed, that can be taken to help reduce the amount of nutrient fuel that is discharged from our stormwater treatment systems into these waterways. So here's the first kind of revelation. Where does nitrogen come from? We know we mine the phosphorus from the ground. We mine nitrogen fertilizer primarily from the atmosphere. At 80%, nitrogen is the most common element in the atmosphere. And although some plants can naturally fix or extract nitrogen from the atmosphere, it's very stable within the atmosphere. However, a little over 100 years ago, a German chemist named Fritz Haber, pictured in the lower left-hand corner, figured out a way to extract nitrogen from the atmosphere in anticipation of World War I. By 1950, this process was pretty well understood globally and kicked off what's called the Green Revolution, which was the ability to easily grow food through fertilizing plants to serve population growth. This graph shows in blue the dramatic increase in what's called reactive nitrogen that's been pulled from the atmosphere since 1950. It's been very successful in feeding an ever-growing population. In some ways, that's been a feedback loop in that the growing population has used more and more nutrients, fertilizer. But the other unintended consequence of the synthetic reactive nitrogen extraction is the over-reliance on chemical fertilization to increase yields and grow things at the expense of building and maintaining healthy soil. Healthy soil can naturally move and extract nitrogen and feed the plants with it. This is how organic farming works. They don't use chemical fertilizer. They build soil, and the crops are incidental to a certain degree. So the other thing is that a lot of crops can only uptake about 50% of this fertilizer. So the rest goes into the soils and water, and that excess nutrients and nitrogen goes into our waterways. Second thing, there was a colleague with the Southwest Florida Water Management District several months ago gave me a copy of the Brandt Study from the University of Miami that was mentioned. So this was discussed briefly in the public comment section, but I just wanted to summarize its conclusions. Basically what they did was they were able to find good data sets to compare of red tide abundance concentrations, if you will, between the decade 1954 to 1963 and the decade 1994 to 2002. And what they found was in the latter decade, the red tide abundance had increased approximately 13 to 18-fold, and that the abundance of red tide along the shoreline had increased 20-fold between what's 12 to 20 miles out. They also noted that the red tide in the earlier decade occurred primarily in the fall months, but in the latter decade it also occurred in winter and the spring months as well as the fall months. So the duration had increased as well as the abundance of it. And their conclusion was that although red tide is naturally occurring, increases in nutrient availability along the shoreline from human-related activity over the past half century are considered a major factor for the increase in red tide abundance. Coincidentally, and this was mentioned too, water quality sampling data collected by Milk Marine under contract with Sarasota County and published on the Sarasota County's Water Atlas, which is a great resource for anyone. They have all this data on there. I'd like to acknowledge John Ryan with Sarasota County Stormwater Department is here this evening as well. He kind of manages that data. But it's shown to everyone's surprise that nitrogen concentrations have been increasing gradually in Sarasota Bay for the past 20 years. I downloaded the data for Lemon Bay and found almost the exact same trend over the past 20 years. So this data and this finding is independent of but consistent with the conclusions of the University of Miami study that says that there's a greater abundance of red tide along the shoreline. There's something happening along the shoreline, and the data is indicating that nutrient levels have increased along the shoreline and are continuing to increase. And this is despite significant public investments, as mentioned, in stormwater quality improvements, fertilizer restrictions, septic tanks programs, and improvements in wastewater treatment and recycling. These public investments they have to be reducing nutrients. Why is nitrogen increasing anyway? Okay, so since 1995, the state of Florida has recognized that nutrient levels, phosphorus and nitrogen, were increasing in the waterways throughout Florida. They consider that when it gets to a certain point that the waters become impaired, and that list of impaired waters throughout Florida has been growing for 20 years. They also, and this is from all the data that they've been collecting, they also looked at stormwater ponds, and what they found was, as mentioned earlier, is that stormwater ponds as a means of stormwater treatment are only efficient to about 40–45% removal of nitrogen. The target that's presumed has been 80%. Doesn't matter how big or deep the lake is, you reach a point of diminishing return at 40–45%, and that's all you can get. So the state embarked on a decade-long process that engaged the state university research resources. They convened a technical advisory committee that I was fortunate enough to serve on. We met every month in 2009 and in 2010 in Orlando at the University of Central Florida. That was the lead research agency. And they developed a stormwater treatment criteria manual and to better reduce nutrients. And that was the sole and only intent of that updated rule, was to address nitrogen and phosphorus, nothing else. That is the issue that they've recognized for quite a while. And so what happened? Well, they did develop a 400-page design manual, draft legislation, and a schedule for public hearings and adoption through 2010 and then 2011. But unfortunately, and probably largely due to the recovery of the economy, 2008, we had the Great Recession, the incoming administrator put the brakes on any new regulations. This was actually an update of the existing regulations based on better science, but for those reasons, this rule was never implemented. So now we have a new administration and the fresh experience of what happens if we don't manage nutrients and impaired waters that have increased over the last 8 to 9 years. So we have the opportunity to kind of hit the restart button and look at implementing this rule, be it a decade later. What are these advanced stormwater treatment BMPs that the state is looking at and included in the manual? Well, it still includes stormwater ponds because they do provide a benefit, but we need to do something on top of that. It was mentioned one of the key things that's already being utilized in a limited way for irrigation is actually recycling that stormwater, taking some of that stormwater and using it to irrigate landscapes and plants. It actually removes that nutrient load from discharging. It could be done again in the footprint of existing lakes or proposed lakes, so it doesn't really take up any more land. They also have all kinds of design criteria for what's called green infrastructure, pervious pavement, green roofs, etc., that is generally applicable in urban redevelopment type projects. There's a number of passive or organic nutrient reduction media such as, believe it or not, wood chips. If they're in an anaerobic condition with little oxygen, they can actually cause the nitrogen to turn back to gas and go in the atmosphere through a process called denitrification. Biochar, something called biochar we've been working with, and there's others. So there are technologies out there that are being looked at and that could be implemented to address these issues. I just wanted to quickly give an example of stormwater harvesting and recycling. This is being used primarily for irrigation. There are numerous examples in our district of agriculture doing this. Under the Water Management District's Farms program, they actually cost share for agriculture to recycle their water for irrigation to reduce groundwater withdrawals in the southern water use caution area. It's called, tailwater recovery in agriculture, but it's essentially stormwater recycling. Developers and existing communities, there's examples of them doing it as well, primarily for irrigation. This is an example of Venice Golf and Country Club in Venice that's...
I just want to remember we have about 3 minutes.
Okay, thank you. That's been doing this, and we can actually calculate the amount of nutrients that are being recycled every year. So, in summary, this is the timeline of what we know. Red tide abundance and duration has been increasing over the last 50 to 60 years. Nitrogen concentrations in Sarasota Bay and Lemon Bay have been increasing over the last 20 years. State water bodies designated as impaired for nutrients have been increasing over the past 20 years. And the regulations have been drafted. They're ready to go to public hearing to start addressing the deficit in the ability of certain stormwater systems to use nutrients. And we have, in 2019 and beyond now, the opportunity to hit the restart button and resolve to ask the new administration to reinitiate the stormwater treatment, public hearings, and adoption process. And that's important that it goes through the public hearing process before adoption. That's where it was left off. So the preventative and proactive action requested is that in addition to public investments needed to retrofit for existing problems created by the past, and not to fall further behind, that the state of Florida move to reinitiate the statewide stormwater treatment rule to help address nitrogen, phosphorus nutrients which feed harmful algae blooms like red tide. A draft resolution has been prepared and can be provided to the city of North Fork for consideration to do just that at potentially a future meeting. And with that, I thank you greatly for your time, and those that are here dressed in blue.
I'm passing out that draft resolution to everybody up here on the dais. I don't expect anybody to enact a resolution right now without looking into it and it being vetted through the attorney's office. But this is something I personally, and I know several of them out here, would like to see kicked off, and asking the state to pick this manual back up, complete it, vet it out, and start following some of these procedures. It's not going to correct all of it, but it's going to correct some of it, because it's a huge effort. And so I will be putting on another agenda, hopefully the 6th, so that gives us some time to review it and see if we want to pass a resolution asking the state to pick this back up. That resolution will then be used as a footprint for other governmental entities. At Florida's League of Cities, water quality was the #1 priority. They already know that this presentation and resolution and stuff were being looked at by our commission. They are interested in it, have already been asking for it. And there are several other organizations that would like to use that resolution as a footprint to press the state. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to look for some questions here. I just want to remind that we have a big agenda, so we're going to move forward to it. And I'm sure the gentleman will be always available for any phone calls or anything that we want to do. Go ahead, Commissioner, for Vice Mayor.
I know, it's going to take time. So that was an amazing PowerPoint presentation, sir, and thank you for your time and your presentation. I do have one request. Is it possible to send a copy of the PowerPoint presentation to the city clerk's office so that it can be uploaded and put as part of our backup materials in case anybody from the public would like to see it?
Absolutely.
Would you please, and city clerk, if you could get with him?
It's really on the computer, I didn't exactly, we already worked that prior to, so.
Okay, I was unaware of that, so.
No problem.
I am on with the Charlotte Harbor National Estuary. I'm the representative for this commission. And I think this is something that would be very interesting to them. I don't know if you could get me your contact information. I would be very grateful, so that way then I can share it with them to see if maybe you could do a presentation to them, because they have other government entities that are their representatives there too. So it might start that snowball to become an avalanche. So if you could get me that contact information, I would be grateful.
Yeah, I serve on the Technical Advisory Committee for the Charlotte Harbor.
Oh, you do?
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
and Jennifer Hecker,
Right.
Yeah.
she actually served on the Technical Advisory Committee for this new stormwater rule back in the day.
So are
She's
you?
probably pretty familiar with it, but I will say the people that served on it may not remember why they were doing it. And it was
Okay.
all about nitrogen phosphorus.
So maybe we just need to replant the seed
Yeah,
instead of the weed and get that to grow.
sounds good.
That's why I call it the missing link, because we have research from Mo that's really good, but then you have these plans in the system at the water district level, and he's like, ding, 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 you know, we did this, we looked at this, and this is why we did this, so I'm thankful for you.
And just throwing out another suggestion, even though I'm no longer the representative for the board for the Regional Planning Council, maybe that might be another avenue to start spreading the information to. Because I know this, our Regional Planning Council is South Florida, that was greatly impacted by this, I can get you that contact information to see if maybe they would be interested in chatting with you also.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Commissioner Luke, for putting this on.
Oh, this is good. Mr. Ryan, thank you very much. A lot of your stats are in your hands across the water and the Northport locales. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. We're going to move forward to our public hearings.